What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? My mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't locked, who knows what would have happened to her. I worked in the oil fields of South Texas, near the border. This would happen quite often. One person would stand in the road and force you to stop. They looked like they needed help or their car was broken. Just an excuse to make you stop, really. And then, once you did, more would come out and jump or kill you and steal all your stuff. It happened so much that we were all instructed to keep going and not stop, even if it meant running them over. The logic being that anyone who won't move out of the way is up to no good. Case in point, one of my co-workers' wives was driving home on a remote 2-lane highway when someone walked out into the road and tried to stop her. When she saw him, she was going too fast to stop and swerved to avoid hitting him. She called the police and told them that there was someone that appeared to be from across the border that was trying to stop cars and looked like they needed help. The police investigated and found the exact spot where she swerved to miss hitting the guy, because there were 4 freshly run over corpses in the ditch. The Nature boat train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any time. A 251 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Khayyam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued, and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes, and it really explodes. The whole town of Khayyam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged, and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died, and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced. I feel like this was intentional, not an accident. Why were so many extremely explosive and flammable materials stored together? How did the train travel 20 kilometers on its own without anyone noticing? And most importantly, how did it gain 50 meters in elevation over that distance? The 1904 Cincinnati Private Disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop and roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he had plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out. Walked back up to the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. Ed Kemper murdered college women because his mother worked at that college, and he claims he wanted to destroy everything she loved. Then, he murdered his mother and decapitated her, raped her head and her body, set her head on a shelf and screamed at it for hours. Then, he murdered her best friend and turned himself in, relaying the whole story in detail, crying. It hurts, because I'm not a lizard. I didn't crawl out from under a rock. I came from my mother's vagina. And in a rage, I went right back in. Ed Kemper quote from a police interview. He would bury the heads of the women he killed in his mother's backyard. He lived with her. He angled the head to where they were pointed, upwards, facing his mother's bedroom window. He would later say that he did this purposely because his mother always wanted to be looked up to. A guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, an investigator shows up and sees the body, calls 911, and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels when bent over was basically 0. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. They could breathe, but the air they were breathing contained no oxygen. The human body can't tell the difference. This is from South Africa. The woman is called Alison Botha, and she was abducted, raped, and then choked until she blacked out. She was driven into a secluded area, stabbed 30 times in the abdomen, and 16 times in the throat, and left for dead on the side of the road. She had to use her shirt to keep her organs inside her body and hold her head up because of a damaged muscle in her neck, and proceeded to crawl to the road, where she was eventually spotted and rescued. She survived the attack, and now does motivational speaking, I believe. Many years ago, before there were cell phones, we had these things called pagers strapped to our hips. Someone would page you with a phone number, and you would call them back when you got to a phone. As an on-call technician working in the audiovisual field, my pager would go off all the freaking time. Like most people who used pagers, our clients knew that if you followed up your number with a 911, that would indicate to the technician to stop what they were doing and call right away. Although it was always busy, I rarely, if ever, got any 911s. One afternoon, traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager goes off with a number I don't recognize, followed by the 911. I find the first exit and pull into a little truck stop looking place outside of Plant City to use the payphone. This takes maybe 3 minutes tops. I walk in, ask for some change, and head to the wall where there are 4 payphones to choose from. I put my quarter in and dial the number displayed on my trusty pager. It rings, and rings, and rings, and rings. I think to myself, what the F? Who would page me with a 911 and not answer their phone? It's just about then that I noticed another ringing sound in addition to the one in my ear. I pull the handset from my ear, and 2 phones over, on the wall, another payphone is ringing, but with an incoming call. I hang up my handset, and the ringing stops on the other phone. I walk a few paces over, pick up the handset, and look at the phone number printed above the buttons. I look at the number on my pager. I look at the number on the phone. I look at the number on my pager again. I look at the phone, again. Except for the 911, they are identical. I kinda lose my breath for a second, and then I make my way over to the girl at the counter and ask if she saw anyone use a payphone. She said I was the only person in the store in the last hour. The whole episode probably took 15 minutes, but man, I was freaked out. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I just wanted out of there. I get about 10 miles down the highway and come up a scene that looked like a bomb went off. 4 cars piled up involving a tractor trailer hauling a load of steel that had come loose. State troopers and paramedics just arriving. I pulled over to the side and held the best I could, but it was all pretty much over once it began. I have no idea why I got that page, or from whom or what, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't, I would not be alive to write this today. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in a tub. Hours later, I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room and find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then, he slowly starts backing out, while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods, and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy cut his throat on it, and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. Dude is lucky he didn't get decapitated. Yep, that has happened where I am from a few times, usually people on snowmobiles. I was about 6 when it happened to a group of teens out snowmobiling near my parents' farm. The other kids came to the house covered in blood, shaking and sobbing, asking to call an ambulance for their friends. The 2 kids who were injured did not make it. One was partially decapitated. I have never been on, and never will be on, a snowmobile. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. She's still alive today and became an artist. Nutty Potty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body is still in the cave. Didn't they almost get him out, but then one of the pulleys snapped and he got trapped even worse? That is my personal nightmare. Amateur rugby. Guy gets hit pretty hard and dislocates his hip. While waiting for the ambulance, a guy runs up saying he's a physio and can at least relocate the joint. He cracks the hip back into its socket, and the guy screams. One of his testicles had been jolted out of place in the accident, and had been chilling out in the empty hip socket. Squish. Apparently this one's fake, don't worry. There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. 3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS was Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later due to the lack of air. They never knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. Harrison Okene, 2013 Nigerian boat sinking. He was trapped in a boat for 3 days at the bottom of the ocean. In this video, the diver finds the area Harrison is in, sees a hand a few feet from his face, and reaches out to grab it. Only then did they realize the person was alive. 30 seconds later, the diver enters the air pocket Harrison has been surviving in. He passed out on the way up, but he made it. In my town, in the early 90s, there was a notorious killer that had all of British Columbia, Canada, on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was a friend with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently, he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back at any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left, she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. The guy's name was Terry Driver. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddle on top of me with his hands over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say try because when you are truly terrified, it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet tall, and she was 5'3", and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took half out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. The story of Hisashi Ouchi. He suffered radiation exposure, so thought that his DNA was destroyed, and he probably would have died in a matter of days or even hours. But doctors kept him alive for almost 3 months. He was conscious and begging for death, as his body literally fell apart. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. If so, please consider subscribing. There will be more Reddit videos. I plan on covering some of these stories in more detail. And there are other videos in my channel all related to horror and video games. See you in the next one.